Good evening. Happy to see all of you here this evening. Most of you, I'm sure, probably know, but me and Will and Mary will be gone starting on Wednesday. I believe Tom Bentley this next Wednesday and the week after that will be teaching the class. Tom, you got it all planned? You got it all plotted out yet? That's a thumbs up of a man who's just he's on his way. We'll put her there. So I know Tom will do a great job, and he'll do a great job. So I encourage you on Wednesday, this Wednesday and next Wednesday, to come back for that. Next Sunday morning, Dad will be preaching, and next Sunday night, Brent Baker will be here. So I know we all like to talk to Brent. Brent texted me last week, and he said, you told me when I was coming again, but can you tell me again real quick? And I said, you are coming on Sunday. And he said, I'm glad I asked. So it might have been without him, but I look forward to our trip and look forward to be back with you all. And I know you'll have great folks here teaching you as we go through it as well. What does it mean to be Christ-like? So I've asked that question, and you've heard people mention Christ-like, and that's something that is probably not new to anybody right here. But I'd say if we were to give an answer, one of us might say, well, let's go to Galatians chapter 5, I believe 22 and 23. You might say, well, those are the fruits of the Spirit, right? You know, they're love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Those are 9 fruits of the Spirit. And we talked about those in class a couple years ago. But that is being Christ-like, right? Those things are things that Christ did. So that would be an acceptable answer. Some of you might say, well, we've been talking about this on Sunday nights this summer, and we've talked about honesty and humility, grace and respect. And those are not necessarily fruits of the Spirit, but they're kind of in a similar vein as things that people would do, ways that people would act or respond or what have you. Both of those could be considered Christ-like. Tonight, though, as you see up here on the screen, it says righteousness. And so the question is, where does righteousness fit in? Well, I would dare say that it is a quality that is less pursued than others, in part because it seems like a bridge too far sometimes. You know, if you were to tell me to love people, that's sort of a natural occurrence, right? If you were to say to be honest with people, well, I'm going to try to be honest because I know that there can be, the string can unravel afterwards if I'm not honest with someone. But when you say to be righteous, it's almost like that word is just too far. It's too much of a word, too big of a word. And to be righteous is to be like Jesus, and that can be challenging as well, right? Because we're trying to be Christ-like. We're not trying to be Christ because that's impossible. And righteousness feels like something that Jesus was and maybe I can't be. So it's a challenging word. But it is something that should be a daily goal for us. And I'll speak to myself more than I would to you right here. And so, in what areas are you most tempted to be unrighteous? Well, that answer, if there's 25 people in the room, have different answers. And so when we think about this tonight, these can be challenges for you, but it might not be that you look to the person beside you and say, I agree with that, or you might be seeing it from 2 different perspectives. But what we're going to look at is how can we be righteous or more righteous this evening? Let's talk first about righteousness in our own words. Sometimes it's best to define a word to get a sense of what is being asked. And so if we're going to give an easy to understand definition of righteousness, here's some answers that we might give. One, we might just say doing the right thing is being righteous. That's pretty simple, but doing the right thing. My grandmother, every time we left her house, and I'm sure she told John the same thing. I know she told Jess, but she told me. I'm sure she told Chris and she told John. But every time we left her house, she said, be a good boy. Now, she said that when I was like 3, But I don't really remember exactly how old I was when she died, but I almost guarantee she said it the last time I saw her before then. And what she was saying right there is do the right thing. Do the right thing. Because what she's saying is when you're 3 and you're 13 and you're 33 and 43, however old you were, the right thing might be a different thing, right? But she said, be a good boy. But what she was saying was to do the right thing. Well, that's a simple request, right? Is it easy to do the right thing? That can be tough, right? Well, it can be easy in some categories, but in other categories, it's a little harder. And so if we're talking about righteousness in our own words, you might say doing the right thing. Okay. Well, what about the second one here then? It could be something like obeying laws or commands. That's going to be a little tougher, right? Are there any laws, any commands in the world that you disagree with? We could probably come up with a list, right? We could come up with some hardened lists, but we could also come up with some soft lists, right? You know, I've said this before. Dad and I joke about having to drive from Lancaster to Stanford, and everybody that drives from Lancaster to Stanford goes 43 miles an hour. That's just what it is. The law should say that I get to choose who gets to drive and who doesn't, but it doesn't say that. I might disagree with it, right? But truthfully, we might have laws that we say, I can agree with that one, but I might disagree with another. That's just how it is. Are there commands in the Bible that we might disagree with? Are there requests in the Bible that we might disagree with? I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong for us to do it, but we've talked about this before. There are things that we think maybe it should have been done a different way. If you asked me to do it a different way, maybe I would have. We might disagree with those commands. But whether we agree or disagree is immaterial because they are laws. They are commands. In Matthew chapter 22, Mark chapter 12, Luke chapter 20, all three of those books, you'll find a verse real similar that says by Jesus to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar and to render unto God that which is God. It's a question about taxes and all that. But what the reality is saying is that you are going to live in a place where you may not always agree with what's going on. Happens in your city, happens in your state, happens in your country. And if you said today, I'm just going to pack up, move, and go somewhere else, I dare say it'll probably happen in the other place that you moved to as well. But we have leaders that have jurisdiction. We have to obey the laws. Do you think that there were things that happened in the Bible, or at least in the world of the Bible, that Jesus might have disagreed with? Probably so. Probably the best example is when we talk about the money changers in the temple, right? Well, he gets mad about that, but why were they there in the first place? Somebody had permitted the money changers to be there. Somebody had made the decision or had been asked, or maybe it just sort of happened over time that people could be in here, that they could sell you things, or they could change your money, or they could trade off goods so that you'd be able to say that had happened. Jesus wasn't real thrilled about it. Well, there's all kinds of things such as that. You might say, well, righteousness in my own words is being obedient to God. Maybe we're taking both of those things and putting it right here. Let's look at Matthew chapter 26, verses 38 and 39. It says here, then he said to them, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me. And we'll stop there for just a second to set a little context here. This is the night before Jesus is to be arrested, the night right before Jesus is about to be taken in. He's talking to his apostles, and he said to three of them there, and he says, stay here with me. Notice then he says that he was exceedingly sorrowful. He was, in words that we would use, quite stressed out about his current situation. Verse 39, though, it says, he went a little farther, Jesus, and fell on his face and prayed, saying, oh, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. He's not drinking something, but that cup is the burden, what he's got to carry, what he's going to have to go through. And he says, let this pass from me. This is Jesus who's been with God from the beginning. This is Jesus who knows the plan. This is Jesus, though, who's stressed about a situation that he has to follow through with. He says, nevertheless, he's asked, he says, let this cup pass from me. You ever thought about that verse or that sentence there? What Jesus is saying is what most of us would have been saying probably 2 or 3 weeks or months before then, right? I would really rather not do this. When we think about Jesus as a human, this is maybe the most human thing that Jesus did. Because every one of us would have said the same thing. We're looking for volunteers. You want to do it for me? And said, is there another way? Could we bring somebody? We're looking at it that way. But notice that the verse doesn't end there. But Jesus then says, nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And think about that for a second. What he says there is, I'm still going to be obedient. It would be great if somebody could sub in for me. That would be wonderful. Nevertheless, it's God's plan that we're going to follow. So being obedient to God is a requirement. He was overwhelmed. He was sad and sorrowful. But how does Jesus respond to this? I want to think about it for a second. Jesus responded in a couple things. First of all, he prayed, right? So when we're faced with a challenge, when we're dealing with something that's bothering us, when we're struggling with obedience, one thing we can do is model ourselves after Jesus. We can pray, right? How many of you have ever prayed during a difficult time? Probably all of us have, right? Sometimes we might use the word, it's the least I can do. Well, it might be the most that we can do, but it's not going to hurt anything to pray, because Jesus did the same thing. One thing we could do there, but he was willing to do God's will. A little later in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 8, this is Paul writing, but Jesus is described as being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself and became obedient, and you'll notice there, obedient to the point of death. So he follows through with what was requested of him. Bottom line, righteousness is doing what is right all the time. That's tough, right? That seems like a simple statement, but it's really difficult for us to sometimes follow through with that. All right. So what about in the scriptures? Well, if righteousness is trying to be Christ-like, you could counter that by saying, well, that's really hard. We can't be exactly like Christ. And that's true. But do you remember what Paul told his readers? He said to imitate him, right? But he said, when you're imitating me, in a sense, you're just imitating Christ. He's kind of drawing a little line back to him. And so Paul is saying, you're not trying to be like me, but if you are trying to be like me, it's only because I am trying to be like Christ. There's others in the Bible that we can look at. I want to look at 3. One is we talked about this morning. This is the story of Abraham, and I realized after I got done this morning that I had kind of talked over this tonight by this morning. Sometimes when you got to preach twice in one day, sometimes you forget which one you're talking about. So I hope y'all didn't get too worked up about it. But you remember the story of Abraham. We talked about it 3 hours ago, right? So the story of Abraham and Isaac in Genesis chapter 22. But if you want to sum it up, go to James chapter 2, and let's look at verses 21 and 22 right there. James posits the statement. He says, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? He asked then, do you see that faith was working together with his works? And by works, faith was made perfect. So Abraham had faith, but he also had actions that he had to carry out. And you'll remember that his hand was stopped by God in that story. But he carries out this action. Someone asked the question, what made Abraham righteous? Well, if we say a minute ago that the righteousness is doing what's right, well, first of all, Abraham listened to God. If you were told to sacrifice your child, pretty quickly we're going to turn the ear off, right? Like, I'm not interested in hearing that. But he listens to God. That's the first thing. Second of all, he trusted his faith in God. He trusted that what he was about to do, whatever the end result was going to be, would be right. That can be difficult, right? Trusting faith can be difficult. And so he offered Isaac We know how the story ends. What about the apostles? We talked on Sunday nights, I don't know, 6 weeks ago or 6 months ago or whatever about the different apostles. And of all the apostles, there's some of them that we've got a lot of information about, and there's some of them that we have very little information about. We kind of had to fill in some blanks a little bit with some of these apostles. Let's turn to Acts chapter 5 right now. If you go to Acts chapter 5, in this story, the apostles are being persecuted. Now remember, the apostles, the last thing that they were told by Jesus before he ascended into heaven was he told them that they would need to go into all the world, right? And he said, you're going to need to preach and you're going to need to teach and you're going to go into all these situations. And I would venture to say that the apostles had no idea what they were getting into until they was about halfway into it, right? And then they're probably thinking, wow, this is more than we signed up for. But they're being persecuted, and they're being persecuted for teaching what Jesus had told them to teach.